To TITUBANTI TESTI 8. I have the pleasure to introduce tonight two distinguished guests, very international, Rafael Silva, whom I met in Brazil during my various trips there. So he's a dear friend of mine. While I am in Brazil, he also interviewed me a couple of months ago in fantastic Belém. So if you're curious, you can attend this pathetic interview in Portuguese. And I have also the pleasure to welcome again Luca Grillo from the University of Notre Dame, of course from Italy, but also an habitué of TITUBANTI TESTI. So the text Rafa proposed is a very interesting one, the Certamen, Homeri et Hesiodi, and we are very much looking forward to this discussion. And of course, as you know, I'm not presenting the guests. They are going to present themselves if they want to. And we are curious, of course, in particular, to know why Rafa proposed this text, but also Luca, who will be the first, is free to say something about the interest for this text. I don't know if you were already familiar with it, if you had the chance to read it independently from this meeting. So Luca, please go ahead and welcome to everybody.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Marco, for putting this series together. Always very stimulating. When I think about the pandemic, and I try very hard to think about something good that it brought to us, this is one of the top of the list. So I think it's great, and it's great that it continues. Also, I really wish to thank you, Rafael Silva. It's a real pleasure to meet you in person, kind of in person. But I also want to thank you for the choice of this text. And to address Marco's first question, I did read it a long time ago, but in fact, I did not read it in the nice edition by Paola Vecino, which I think it's very, very helpful. So just to live through the commentary and to look at the translation and the Greek and so on has been not only a way to go back, but hopefully to get a bit deeper. What I plan to, well, my expertise, if anything such applies, is more like on the Latin side. So this was very much refreshing for me to go back to Greek and this Certamen. And especially I'm interested in like the literature of the late Republic. So Cicero, Caesar, historiography, oratory, rhetoric, and so forth. Though at the moment I'm working on a book on irony in Latin literature, and I'm kind of expanding and exploring in various directions. What I plan to do, since, as I hope I made clear already, I claim no expertise whatsoever with this text or context, is literally to just set the stage. And then I have much curiosity and expectation for Raphael's kind of digging deeper and leading us through the specifics of this text. So the first point I'd like to make, which is perhaps quite obvious, is that it's very easy to forget that the typical context from a socio-political and cultural point of view for the Greeks was competitive. So, of course, we know about the Olympics and the races there and so forth, but in so many ways, the production of literature, and in particular production of poetry, was very much a part of this agonistic contest with races, prizes, winners, and losers. This is the case, of course, for theater, if you think about tragedy and comedy, but it's also the case for rhapsodic competitions and people traveling around and trying to one-up each other. Of course, this is also the setting that is imagined in the outlet of the contest itself, which it's interesting because I taught this text only once, and I realized that I kind of skipped the first step, like the competitive context of the production and the performance of literature in the Greek world. Of course, then there is like this irresistible temptation of ancient scholars or poets to fill the gap. So like the cliffhanger for the creation of this, in a way, fake, is Hesiod's autobiographical, again, quote unquote, information about himself competing and winning in this competition, which is mentioned in the Erga and in the Works and Days. And of course, this was something that someone back then in the day, whenever this was put together in the form we have it now, could not leave unclaimed. I'm not going to discuss much about the date. I think actually the introduction to that real edition does it fairly, especially because we are like in the murky waters of oral poetry. So trying to pin down the date as a limited sort of clarity, and in a way also limited advantage. The setting is the funeral of King Amphidamas, which of course, if we think about the 33rd book 23 in the Iliad, is also the setting of the first athletic competitions. So this brings us back to the agon, to the competition, and to the agonia, which is like this powerful struggle for winning and triumphing. The judge is kind of not only one. There seems to be sort of two judges, and of course one wins the popular vote and the other wins the vote of King Panoides, who is the brother of the deceased King Amphidamas. And this is one of the streams that I believe could be productively looked into in more details. So there's like a dichotomy within the text of different voices. And although the official referee of the competition is King Panoides, it's quite clear that the popular vote, so to speak, actually goes to Homer rather than Hesiod. So I think that is also, there's more going on than the simple narrative of the competition. The setting, there seem to be different rounds, and Hesiod does all the questioning and Homer does all the answering. And quite often, well, it's interesting because it looks like Hesiod gets grumpier and grumpier as the competition goes on. He tries over and over to get Homer to no avail. And so he sort of raises the bar with more and more challenging and ambiguous questions. But I think it's also interesting the indication of the Thonos that sort of becomes like a driving force for Hesiod. And I don't know, Raphael, if this makes any sense to you, but it looks like in the broad range of the meanings of Thonos, according to Hesiod himself, like the good and the bad eris or competition, it looks like Hesiod sort of gradually shifts from a positive sort of self-improvement competition to a competition where there is a lot of nastiness and jealousy and perhaps is more sharp-elbowed. So I noticed this as I read through this text, and then I bumped into the Zonon Hesiodos. So Hesiod does become sort of a victim of Zonos, and I wonder if this is a theme that deserves developed more. So as the bar raises and Hesiod gets more and more frustrated and competitive, he tries to challenge Homer with this a series of aporiae. And I think it's incredibly interesting the way that the responses of the verses that Homer gives in response to Hesiod's question not only match, but regularly transform the very meaning of the line uttered by Hesiod. So there's a lot of aprosdoketon, of unexpected lines, that complete the sentence or the period or the thought in a way which takes in a different direction from what you would expect. So there's a lot of wit, which of course also reflects to me the wit of the poet, whoever that was, that he can play with different possibilities and sort of lead us at different forks and enjoy us getting lost and having to retrack our steps back into the other direction, which is the one that Homer takes. The other theme that struck me as I read this again was a sort of disagreement in some of the labels that the author himself, assuming he was a man, that the author himself poses on these authors. So in a way, Hesiod stands for peace and Homer stands for war. But what you see is that as the competition progresses, Hesiod gets more and more competitive, and Homer twists this line that Hesiod throws at him, moving consistently, almost consistently, toward peace. And so there's also like a way to say, perhaps, that you cannot totally pigeonhole these poets as to represent war and peace. And as they progress, the picture gets way more messy and I think way more interesting. It's also interesting because the very personality that you see, and I kind of hinted at this before, is that Hesiod seems much more worrisome than Homer. Homer is the peacemaker. He enjoys the banquet. He's looking for peace and having a good time. I exaggerate a little bit, but Hesiod is looking for the competition. So there's gotta be a winner at the end, and that means that I need a loser to be there in order to make, hopefully, me the winner. Of course, this idea of war and peace is also then reflected, and I read a piece by Paola Vessino also in Aristophanes in The Frogs. And so this idea of them having different sort of functions or symbolizing different spheres of human experience is something that is bigger than this very context. But again, I think that this context, interestingly, casts the same dichotomy, but also complicates it. And then again, I don't know, Raphael, if you want to go there, but scholars have noted an incredible number of parallels between the passage of, okay, give me your best lines from Hesiod and from Homer. And I think the two passages that they choose echo and respond to each other in a way no less than this sort of battle of competing lines that they throw at each other just before. Another couple of ideas, and again, then Raphael, take them or leave them, and I don't know if you want to go in a completely different direction. Certainly, there's no areas between you and I, right? So, no, another couple of ideas is that I think it's very interesting how the relationship between us as readers and the internal audience. Because sometimes, at least that's what I was taught when I studied this back in a day, the internal audience, like imagine, for example, like the choir of the chorus of Greek tragedy, sometimes it looks like they're meant to lead, sometimes mislead, but still to direct the response of the external audience. While here, I think that the external audience, like us, is sort of invited to take a step back and kind of look critically at the internal audience. And so an aspect that struck me, perhaps because, as I said, I've been working on irony a lot, is there's a good deal of romantic irony here. Romantic irony intended in the way that, for instance, Schlegel intended it. Like this moment when the artist looks at his or her creation and treats it as a creation. Therefore, there's the breaking of the dramatic illusion, and you take a step back and you say, but this is just one possibility. This is just one creation. I think that this idea of extrapolating lines from Homer and Hesiod, and then juxtaposing them out of their original context, heavily plays on this dynamic of romantic irony and invites us in a way through or not through the lenses of the internal audience to take this step back and to look at this for what it is, which is poetry, creation, just one of the myriad of possibilities that could have come up and so forth. And one of the things that I really like of romantic irony is that this moment of detachment is actually not the last word. At the end, is like a loving reaffirmation of the artistic creation. So precisely because I acknowledge that it's finite, limited, I can sublime it precisely because I take this sort of distance and so forth. And then, as I said, I think it's also interesting because the dichotomy between the judgment of the king and the judgment of the internal audience, as if almost like Homer gets the popular vote and Hesiod gets the vote of the king, I think I take and I read it as just one more way in which we are invited to look at the very contest and at the very outcome and these very lines with a sort of detached, perhaps smiling and enjoyed critical attitude and critical eye. So these are my messy considerations. I don't know if it's of any help or use for you, Raphael, but yeah, I just wanted to give a general introduction and perhaps indicate a few possible avenues that we can walk in this conversation. Once again, thank you, Raphael, for choosing this piece. I loved it. I just forgot how much I loved it before. And thank you, Marco, for bringing us all together.
Sure. Thank you so much, Luca. And we are now looking forward, of course, to Raphael's presentation. I'm very curious to hear about this choice in particular.
Well, thank you, Luca, for your presentation. It was quite stimulating to hear you. And I thank also Marco Formizano for having invited me to take part of this edition of TITUBANTI TESTI. I've watched some of the previous discussions, and it is a great honor for me to be here today. Well, I thank also the public who has shown some interest in coming here to follow our discussion about Certamen, Homeri, and Hesiodi. And I've chosen this text because last year I wrote a PhD thesis in Brazil, in the University of Minas Gerais, about the history of classical scholarship. And there I had to deal with the symbolic role played by Homer throughout many different manuals about the history of classical scholarship. For instance, John Edwin Sandys, Rudolf Pfeiffer's, among others. And I think that the Certamen has a lot of the trends I found in this, in the way the history of our field is written, and I try to explore it in this PhD thesis. I'll show some of the things I try to interpret in the text. But I begin with two large disclaimers. The first one is that I will not deal with the archaic materials that suggest the existence of a very ancient tradition about a dispute between Hesiod and Homer. I shall not deal with that. And I'll not deal also with Alcidamas and his work. As a young philologist, Friedrich Nietzsche analyzed that problem, defending for the first time in papers from 1870 and 1873, the thesis that part of the Certamen would go back to the work Museion by Alcidamas, a disciple of Gorgias and a sophist from the 4th century BCE. Nietzsche's groundbreaking position found further support in the discovery of two papyri with excerpts from what appears to be an older version of the Certamen, including a probable indication of authorship and title. And both these set of problems had been dealt with by me in my PhD thesis, so we can discuss them later on if you wish so, but I'll not do it right now. So now I share my screen. One moment, so you can have my presentation. Yes, here we go. Okay. So here I shall deal with the late redaction of the Certamen, which has a terminus postquem estimated at around 160 CE, considering Emperor Hadrian is mentioned by the document. And I'll suggest some reflections on its main story, that is, the poetical dispute between Hesiod and Homer. And throughout this presentation, I use Paola Bastino's edition and translation. Well, the Certamen is a work that proposes a biographical introduction to the figures of Hesiod and Homer, including speculations about their families and possible origins, before presenting the situation in which they are about to sail from Aulis to Chalcis, to participate in a competition of Sophia, skill or wisdom, on the occasion of the funeral tributes to Ganicto's father, Amphidamas, the king of Euboea. The narrative also mentions the presence of illustrious citizens in the role of judges, including Panides, brother of the deceased king. The competition basically revolves around the episodic challenge of short performances, including language challenges as a way of displaying knowledge and cunning. The narrator does not create any suspense about the end of the dispute, since he begins by announcing Hesiod's victory right away, but explores the unfolding facts that lead to this result. Apparently, Hesiod's victory is one of the only indisputable facts in that tradition. Regardless of how incredulous some ancient authors have been, that is the invariable result of the competition in all its known forms. And here I quote Tzetzes, for example, who exclaims, "O tes abelterias, o tes anoias, o tes apaideusias, o logo arete kai paideia, o higra criete." Are you not weeping? So I'll explore this kind of position among ancient writers, but also among the modern readers of this text. And I'll try to explain why this attitude has been so major in the history of the reception of this text. And I'll try to in a way, suggest contrary points to this attitude. Regarding the contest itself, it should be noted that Hesiod appears throughout the competition as the one who takes the initiative and challenges Homer in increasingly intricate ways, while Homer is content to solve these challenges, eliminating them with relative ease. As a competition of hexametric verses performed in front of a large audience, the narrative of the Certamen describes not only both performances, but also the audience's reactions. The impression thus created leads to Homer's total favoritism, like Lucas said, which may be a narrative concession to the social status of the poet, Homer in antiquity. The episodic competition is constructed in such a way that Homer's apparent success maintains a crescendo pace from the beginning. At times, the to and fro of challenges and solutions is briefly interrupted by the narrator with some comments on positive reactions by the audience to Homer and the discontent this provokes in his zealous adversary. And here I quote two of these passages. Hesiod, exasperated by Homer's resourcefulness, decided to start an interrogation about unresolved issues. Even with Homer being superior in everything, Hesiod, full of rivalry, begins again. The crescendo reaches the climax of the audience's expectations when the narrator says, after these things had also been recited, the Hellenes all ordered Homer to be crowned, but King Panides ordered each to recite the most beautiful part of his poems. King Panides, name that means he who knows everything, Paneides or Panoides, depending on the edition, is mentioned in the beginning of the narrative and has almost been forgotten at that point of the story, but he intervenes at a crucial moment. Contrary to what the general public seems to believe, his statement demonstrates that from the judge's perspective, Homer's is not surpassing Hesiod. Instead, they are even. Just as one manages to find satisfactory solutions to all the challenging lines formulated by his adversary, the other in turn is successful in tirelessly improvising new lines. That is why King Panides decides to change the terms of the competition, seeking to end it, and orders that the matter be decided by presentations on the most beautiful thing from the poems of each competitor. Calliston ecto onidion poiematon. As in the previous competition, Hesiod takes the initiative and recites the following lines from Works and Days. When the Atlas-born Pleiades rise, start the harvest and the plowing when they set. For 40 nights and days they lie hidden, and after the year has gone round again, they appear for the first time when the iron's sharpened. This is the law of the land for those who dwell close to the sea, as well as for those who inhabit the winding valleys, fertile terrain distant from the swelling sea. Sow naked and plow naked and harvest naked, when everything is in due season. After which, Homer sings the following lines from two places of the Iliad. Around the two Ajaxes, the battle lines stood strong, and neither Ares would have found fault had he joined them, nor Athena, who rouses the people. For the best chosen men were awaiting the Trojans and godly Hector, joining spear close to spear, shield to overlapping shield, shield pushed on shield, helmet on helmet, man on man, and the horsehair crests on the bright helmet ridges touched as they were bending forward. So compact they stood against each other. The deadly battle bristled with the long skin-cutting spears they were holding, the gleam of the bronze from the bright helmets, the newly polished corselets, and the shining shields dazzled the eyes as they came close against each other. The man who enjoyed watching this struggle and did not feel consternation would have been most bold of heart. At this point, brutally reversing the expectations created since the start of the competition, the narrator reports simply, on this occasion, too, the Greeks in admiration praised Homer as his verses were extraordinary beyond expectation, and they asked Panides to award him the victory. But the king crowned Hesiod, saying that it was just for the one who promoted agriculture and peace to win, and not the one who expounded wars and slaughters. So they say that Hesiod gained victory in this way, and receiving a bronze tripod, he dedicated it to the Muses with this inscription. Hesiod dedicated this to the Heliconian Muses when he defeated divine Homer with a hymn at Chalcis. As previously mentioned, the result of the contest seems to have been well known in antiquity. Even so, many readers have registered their annoyance about it. That may be due to a narrative construction of sophisticated, though apparently simple, structure, as several signs suggest that Homer's victory would be inevitable. The apparent ease with which he solves the challenges, the favorable reaction of the public, the exasperation of his opponent. Furthermore, Homer's favoritism with the reading public should not be overlooked. The entire biographical introduction to the Certamen might be intended to review commonplaces in favor of Homer, contrasting them with the apparent unworthiness of Hesiod. While Hesiod's father establishes himself as a poor immigrant next to Helicon, making him a native of the wretched village of Ascra, Homer has been claimed by a multitude of Hellenic cities, and among his many presumed fathers, one finds deities and mythological figures. That divine ascendancy constitutes a subject of the highest distinction, as the reference to the Emperor Hadrian's interest attests. In other words, the Certamen enhances Homer's favoritism with its readers by increasing the contrast between what he represents and what Hesiod is summoned to represent. I do not understand why so many readers, ancient as well as modern readers, have been surprised at its turn of events, but it appears that even the most favorable readers of Hesiod have been guided by Homerocentric assumptions that have hindered understanding of what lies behind the final result of the dispute between these two poets. One ought to consider with attention that excerpt from the Certamen, which is the climax of the narrative. King Panides, a name intended, as I said, as he who knows all, he who knows everything, returns to the scene at that crucial point in order that the unresolved competition be solved through the recitation of the most beautiful thing in the poems of each of the contestants. Hesiod selects an excerpt that marks the beginning of the second half of his works and days. The reference to the Pleiades has a programmatic function, a function, incidentally, recognized by the poem's own manuscript tradition, which sometimes entitles that excerpt as Biblos Deuteros, second book, because those stars mark the seasons and work both in the agrarian reality of the antiquity and within Hesiod's own poem. Furthermore, the choice of the verb archeste, start, in an imperative form of the second person plural, reinforces that dimension by echoing its use in other prominent positions across the archaic hexametric corpus in the proem of Theogony and several Homeric hymns, for example. Additionally, the next verse, built with the particle toi, implies a true call to action in the present, addressing persons, Hesiod's persona's brother, in a manner most immediately, though it also implicates the audience in his performance. There is an excellent indication here of its own presentation context. A festival celebrated in the beginning of spring, when the Pleiades disappear from the sky and work begins once again at the farms after winter. The singer specifies with verbs flexed in a present tense of gnomic value, a fact reinforced by an adverb like autis, again, and by a phrase like periplomenu eniautu, as the year turned, that the current disappearance of the Pleiades would only last 40 nights and days until the work was finished and harvest begun, or for the people seaworthy, sailing resumed. The intended performance context in Hesiod's original poem is a spring festival. Curiously, the Certamen makes its Hesiod, at the request of King Panides, quote precisely that same excerpt as the most beautiful thing in his poems. However, that could present a narrative inconsistency if in the Certamen, Hesiod and Homer have just taken a boat to cross from Aulis to Caucasus. That action is necessarily supposed to take place after the Pleiades have returned to the sky, allowing safe resumption of navigation activities. Even so, that does not render the excerpt inappropriate for that performance context represented in the Certamen, because these lines from Works and Days are flexible enough to be adapted with equal ease to an early summer date, as they thematize the cycle of agricultural labors under the sign of the Pleiades' perpetual return. In other words, that same excerpt can be recited with equal pertinence during the funeral games in honor of King Amphidamas, at a time when the seas for Euboea have just become navigable again. If that interpretation is correct, the message proclaimed by Hesiod is, the Pleiades have just risen back into the skies and the iron is sharp. Let the harvest work begin. On the other hand, there is one more aspect that is not at all negligible for an understanding of what lies behind the outcome of the dispute between Hesiod and Homer. The information on the circumstances of King Amphidamas' death. Regardless of the historicity of the Lelantine War, the ancient tradition on the subject seems to be well preserved in a significant excerpt from Plutarch's Symposium of the Seven Sages, when he specifies that Amphidamas was a warrior man who, having prepared many actions against the Eretrians, fell during the battles in the region of Lelantine. Eretria is a city in the eastern region of Euboea, the same island on which Chalcis is located. Thus, the infamous Lelantine War is internal to the island of Euboea, a fratricide that dragged the rest of the Hellenic world into a cycle of death and destruction, remembered for many future generations. Again, for the present argument, it does not matter whether the war really happened. The image formed around that conflict is at the center of the issue, as seen here by Thucydides. The war between Chalcids and Eretria was the one that, in the past, most divided the rest of the Hellenic world between alliances with one side or the other. Such is the immediate historical background of the poetical contest between Hesiod and Homer. The funeral games happen in honor of Amphidamas, the king of Euboea, who had been killed in a fratricidal war fought between two peoples from the same island, Chalcidians and Eretrians. In the face of that, what is Homer's choice in a Sophia competition as the most beautiful part of his poems? One only ought to reread the excerpt quoted previously to understand the clumsiness of his decision. Homer selects a battle scene. As noted by numerous commentators, that scene appears to depict hoplitic combat techniques and reflects on the pervasive violence of that type of warfare. There is a tone of censorship in the last lines of the excerpt, as if the Homeric narrator managed to understand the warlike jubilation to some extent, but not the boundless slaughter that eventually ensues. Even so, those verses invoke bloodshed and carnage with a verbiage that was perhaps inconvenient, even for a warlike society as that of the ancient Hellenes, during a common event when songs from the archaic hexametric tradition were usually presented. That is, the civic religious festival and the banquet. Yet, to present those lines during the funeral of a king fallen in a fratricidal war that devastated his own subjects touches on a very recent wound and thus risks a resumption of offensive actions, with mutually devastating results. All is beyond due measure, and that is precisely what Homer proposes. To recapitulate the argument, the time of the year when funeral games are held in honor of Amphidamas coincides with the seas becoming navigable again and the resumption of agricultural work. Euboea had just witnessed the horrors of a fratricidal war between Chalcidians and Eretrians, and it is significant that the war season in ancient Greece is precisely the period between late spring and summer. Hesiod sings verses encouraging the resumption of field work. Homer recites an excerpt from a poem with splendid images of combat and slaughter. Now, who displayed more Sophia? For the people impressed with verses that surpass all limits, and here I quote, parato prosekon gegonoton ton epon, including the limits of convenience, the one who should be crowned remains Homer, regardless of the harmful consequences of that choice. For the new king of Euboea, Panides, the one who knows all, there is simply no doubt that the victory is Hesiod. It is hard to understand why the readers of the Certamen are so surprised with that, since the narrator himself concludes the story with the clearest verdict. The king crowned Hesiod, saying that it was just for the one who promoted agriculture and peace to win, and not the one who expounded wars and slaughters. And here I conclude saying that this story remains extremely pertinent today, as we witness, with almost no reaction at all, a genocide happening with the silent endorsement of the whole world. If we knew better, the United Nations could play the role of King Panides in avoiding the reward to those who promote wars and slaughters. But the real question remains, can we really support a responsible policy towards nature, agriculture, and peace? And here I finish sharing the bibliography on which I based this presentation, and thanking you for your patience listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Virtual applause to you. And yeah, as you know, I normally ask the other discussant, in this case, Luca, if you want to add a brief comment to offer a brief response, perhaps, before we open the discussion to the audience.
I think I'm perfectly fine moving to the discussion right away. But thank you very much, Rafael. That was very rich. Thank you.
Okay, so I see Federico.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, both of you, and sorry for my Italian. I'm speaking from Palermo, or Misano, maybe. Some question, large question. Sorry for this. For some time, I have been thinking that Hesiod is a poet and a person suffering from mythomania. How to say, not aristocratic like the Homerids. Although he is therefore no more popular. The idealism, the Platonism of poetics is not accompanied by the principle of hope, which remained perhaps in Pandora's box. So I ask myself and yourself, if this frustrated idealism, this wavering faith, according to which the muses are true and false, the contentions right and wrong, and its pessimistic theodicy as a compensation in the vanity of the name of the defeated tripod, then the Certamen, or Certamen in Italian, we conscious of the ecclesiastic pronunciation, not Certamen, but Certamen. Although a later work, if this later, posthumous, naturally, work is of postmodern meta-literary fiction is well suited to this self-citationist character of the poet from Accra. This is my question, and I comprehend how Nietzsche was against this. How to say this rinunciatario in Italian, how to say in English, I don't know, character of Hesiod, how it shown, maybe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, either Rafael or Luca or both of you, if you want to. answer?
In generally, all the world is asking itself how to prevent war. But maybe Homer asks ourselves how to put war into peace, not to prevent. So this is my opinion.
Okay, guys, do you want to say something?
Well, if I understood correctly, I would say that the idea of a rivalry between Hesiod and Homer can be traced back to archaic materials that had been handed down on Hesiod's name, even if the attribution to Hesiod had been constantly questioned. So we see, like in the rhapsodic practice of the classical age, the same trend of polemic between the Hesiodic tradition and the Homeric one, as it is attested in Plato's Ion, for example. So I think that the biographical tradition explores these trends very powerfully, like Barbara Graziosi showed in her book, like commenting in a way on these verses when they write the biographies of these poets. Nietzsche, his interest for this text, I think, is linked very much with the problem of writing and orality, because Alcidamas, on his work on sophists, had taken a position, I think, very close to the one Nietzsche defends in some of his texts of the same epoch, from around 1870, 1873, when he was lecturing about the universities in Germany. And well, here I disagree with Nietzsche, because he tried to show that Homer was the one improvising verses, while Hesiod was the one who had previously prepared everything. But here I think Nietzsche understood incorrectly the text, I think. But I didn't explore this question of writing or improvising verses, but we could do that, I think. Thank you for the question.
I would. Thank you very much for the question. I agree. It's a very stimulating question. I think it can be taken at least in two different directions. So a couple of observations. The first one is that I find it very interesting that if I think about the athletic competitions in Iliad 23, there's a spectacular, I would just say, complete change in the mood. They open with this gloomy, sad, funeral atmosphere, and they end up with this powerful celebration of life and joy. And so, to me, it's always a good reminder, following your line of thought, Federico, how in Homer, at least, competition is presented as a valuable alternative to war. So it is a way to bracket war out. And it's interesting because, I repeat, of course, the agon between Homer and Hesiod is presented in the context of a funeral game and competition. So I wonder if this can be seen as, following your suggestion, Federico, be seen as a possible solution, a possible way to transition from war to a more peaceful and still competitive, but still peaceful type of context. So this is one observation. The other observation, as you were talking, I was just realizing that it's very easy, at least for me, to look at these lines very much through the filter of Alexandrinian poetry, or the very idea of the Callimachean ideal of the pure and well-polished and so forth, or to put it with Horace, the person who is like Lucilius, actor in outline, stans pede in uno, right? Just like standing on one foot, which is dismissed very negatively. It seems to me this hasn't happened yet. So the idea of being able to play that game almost like fencing, like scherma, with one line against the other, has a lot to do with the speed and the ability to respond quickly. So I'm just saying I'm aware of me being tempted to approach this text and these lines from a poetic ideal which didn't come to fruition yet at the time. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. Craig? I see Craig.
Oh yeah, do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, Raphael, thank you for you zeroed in on much of your presentation on exactly the question I was thinking of when I read this. I should say I have never read this text before, so this was my first quick introduction to it. But my question was, yeah, what about the choice of those two passages? You know, from Hesiod and Homer, tokaliston. And as I read them, I thought, in what way could these two passages be tokaliston of those two poems? When I think of the Iliad, I think of many other passages than that. So I was curious because I don't know anything about it, and I don't know anything about the scholarship. So you gave an answer, which was anchoring it in the moment of the narrative, right? Is that the usual way of interpreting this question? Have scholars even really asked this question much? Like, why those two passages in particular? One thing I did notice, the Homeric passage in particular, if you read it aloud, it is pretty remarkable in terms of the sound effects. So I'm wondering if that's part of it. And then the second point around that was the other moment that you focused on that I also focused on, which was who is it? The king, right? The king describing these two verses. So Hesiod ton epi Georgian keirenen prokalumenon, and Homer ton polemus kai sphagas diexionta. I wonder if there's a difference between those two verbs. So that Hesiod is prokalumenon peace, which Bassino translates, I think, as promote, and Homer is simply diexionta, war. He's just telling of it. He's not promoting it, which goes to that huge interpretive question of, is the Iliad in some way celebrating war or simply narrating it? So those are two related thoughts.
Thank you very much, Craig, for the questions. Normally, the choice of these passages had been interpreted as symbolizing, in a way, Homer's poetry as opposed to Hesiod's poet. Mainly after like the classical period, I think. Ugo Koning has a very interesting book called Hesiod, the Other Poet, from 2010, I think, where he tries to follow the ways Hesiod has been presented by his readership throughout antiquity, normally as opposed to Homer. But after the classical period, they were like normally put together before that, prior to that. But after the classical period, they were more and more like put in distant places, like we see in the way Aristotle reads Hesiod or reads Homer, and this trend has been deepened in the next centuries. So the idea of Hesiod representing peace, representing agriculture, does a lot of violence to Hesiod's texts. Also, there are a lot of scenes of battle in the Theogony, for example. But apparently the tradition made that in its reading of Hesiod, and also made that in the tradition of reading Homer as like the singer of war, the singer of combat. And this book of Ugo Koning is very interesting in showing that happening throughout the reception of these two figures, Homer and Hesiod, as opposed to Homer. So yes, I think is that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question by Sabine and or Marco.
Marco. Hi. The question is, from me. I'm not a classical philologist, so I'm not very competent or not competent at all. I've been working a lot of time on Nietzsche, and from this source I know the text. I won't go into Nietzsche now, but what interests me now is, well, after Hesiod has won, what happens in this text? Hesiod wants to thank for his victory, goes to the oracle, gets an oracle, he misunderstands it, and because of this misunderstanding, he goes to his death. And this is a very inglorious death, also in the version of this text. So we could say, okay, Hesiod has won in a way that is a bit strange, but this victory is the cause of a inglorious defeat at the end of the story. Would you agree with this, or how do you see a connection between this contest and the prosecution of the text?
Well, thank you for the question. It is a very interesting one. Well, the thing is that Hesiod's death is reported straight away after winning the dispute against Homer. So maybe a connection is being suggested by the author of this version of the story, because it is an inglorious death indeed, even if Hesiod can count on a recognition of his status, because the dolphins give back his corpus to the inhabitants of the land to receive the funeral honors, and so maybe there is some suggestion about that, but I don't see it like in the text. It is not dealt with in this way. Besides, Homer himself is not completely able to understand the oracle he receives about his death, and also dies a very inglorious death after not recognizing the meaning of the words of the young boys, the young fishermen, in a passage that is quoted by curiously by Heraclitus. Heraclitus quotes the one of the versions of the enigma posed by them to Homer. So, well, I'm not sure if I answered, but thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. Any other reaction? Any other remark or question to Raphael and Luca? There is another one. I don't know. Is Marco or Sabine? No, I see.
Marco, sorry, can I add quickly something to what Raphael was saying?
Yeah.
In a way, it's just Raphael said it all, but I also see that how this could go absolutely in two different directions, because of course for Greeks, dying right after victory is the most glorious and most desirable possible end, but there is the misinterpretation of the oracle. And you think, well, if Hesiod or Homer were as good readers as they are in understanding the oracle, I think there's yet one more layer of complications that are thrown at the reader at the end of this. So I think it's just fascinating how this can give another spin to the whole competition.
Okay, Marco again, is that correct?
Yes, but very short. But what was important for me was the causal connection. If Hesiod hadn't won, if Homer had won, Hesiod won't have gone to the oracle, and so he wouldn't been killed. This is, I think, this is very clear in the text also. Because he has won, he gets killed in the end of the day. This is a chain, but this, I think, is rather clear in the text.
Well, the idea is very interesting. I haven't thought about it, but I will reread the text as that, having that in mind, to see if the idea of an internal causation is suggested. Because if you're right, maybe the text is suggesting exactly that being considered a victor could have been like the cause of Hesiod's death, the cause of Hesiod's destruction. Yes.
Another assassinated poet like Orpheus, the poet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other? I see. No, I don't see. I saw a little hand, yellow hand, but it disappeared. So maybe it was an older one. Okay. Well, I was thinking, of course, as a reader of Ovid, at the contest between Arachne and Minerva. I was trying to make sense of this comparison, but I don't have much to say because, of course, different situations, different constellation of meanings. I don't know whether you were thinking about it or if you had this possible comparandum in mind. It's different, I realize. I mean, they present both. The only thing would be that they present both their best. They are free to present, I mean, to produce their best. But of course, in Ovid, there is much sense of self-reflexivity, thinking about his own text and about the metamorphosis, the rapes, and so on. So it is different. But maybe besides the content, if there is a logic of the Certamen, I don't know. I was just thinking.
Well, if you're thinking about how about the eclogues, the Amabian verses in the eclogues?
Right. Yeah.
And the four Theocritus before that, but yes, there's yeah. I think that one constant is again the competition, but also the as you hint at, Marco, this sort of meta-literary reflection of creation as something that can be looked at and judged and put up for competition and so forth. So that's why I was mentioning romantic irony before.
Yes, I mean, when we have a text like the Certamen, it's very interesting to see different trends coming from different literatures, let's say it like that, because if the Museion by Alcidamas was really written as like a previous work that informed in a way the Certamen, Alcidamas was having a dialogue with Aristophanes, with Plato, and this kind of things enter in his version. But if the Certamen was written from this material, like 160s from the Common Era, we can expect like having Alexandrian poetics in mind as well. We can have the Roman poets' contributions being acknowledged in a way or in another. So the problem is the author is anonymous. We don't know him or her, I mean, and we don't know even if he actually knew Latin poetry or Latin literature. Well, he mentions the Emperor Hadrian, but that does not mean much.
Okay, so if I don't know if anybody else would like to say something, otherwise we say thank you to both Raphael and Luca. This was fantastic, very interesting text and inspiring. And I hope to see you next month, actually 27th of November. So this time, yeah, because I'm going to Australia. This is the reason why it wasn't possible to accommodate any other talk between, because of the huge difference of time. And yeah, I wish a very good day, a very good evening, wherever you are, and we see each other soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Marco.
So thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, Marco. Bye, Rafael. We'll connect.
Arrivederci.
Yes, for sure. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Ciao, Luca.